Welcome to the Ancient Art of Facts. I'm Doug Powell, and today we're going to be talking about the historical and archaeological features of Jesus' birth. Now, if you took a picture of Jesus' birth, this is probably not what you would have seen. There are a number of layers of distortion that combine to make a typical nativity scene. You've got time compression, so events that take place afterward are combined together. You've got a mistranslation of a key word in the story. You've got a lack of understanding of the culture of that time. And lastly, there's the influence of a second century legend. We're going to peel back each of these layers and try to recover what the birth of Jesus would have been like. And to do it, I'm going to use images of Palestine from the earliest days of photography because technology came to this part of the world so late that the images show a world that looks practically unchanged from the time of Jesus. So let's start by putting things in order. Both Matthew and Luke have accounts of Jesus' birth, but they each contain different details. Harmonizing these two accounts reveals a number of interesting things that get lost if you just take them separately or each kind of feature in the event in isolation. One thing that you may have wondered is where any of this information comes from in the first place. Scholars believe that Matthew and Luke both use Mark as a source for their Gospels. And they also point out that there's some material that is in both Matthew and Luke. But there are things that are only in Matthew and there are things that are only in Luke. And if you look at the material that's only in Luke, most of it is the testimony of women. Now, the tradition for Luke's death is that he died in Ephesus. And that's also the tradition for both Mary and John, who is the caretaker of Mary after Jesus died on the cross. So if there's truth to the tradition, then Luke would have had access to Mary. And that's why Luke 2:19 says, Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. How would he know that? There's a good reason that he learned that from Mary herself. So let's go to Nazareth. This is Nazareth in 1877. Here it is in 1890. You can see that there are still open sewers in the street. Here's an ancient house in Nazareth. And here's the well. This is now known as Mary's Well. It was in Nazareth that Mary was visited by the angel Gabriel. She was probably in the range of 14 to 16 years old. Luke 1:26 through 38 says that Gabriel appeared to Mary and told her that she would give birth to a son through the Holy Spirit. He will be called Jesus and be the Son of the Most High, the Son of God, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. She was also told that her cousin Elizabeth was 6 months pregnant. And after Gabriel appeared, Mary went from Nazareth to the hill country of Judea to be with Elizabeth for 3 months to help with the birth. Now, we don't know exactly where Elizabeth lived, but there is a tradition that tells us where John the Baptist was born. So here's a map of modern Israel. We have Nazareth up at the top. You can see Jerusalem there. And according to tradition, the birthplace of John the Baptist in the hill country is known as Ein Karim. And Ein Karim at that time was 5 or 6 miles west of Jerusalem. And Jerusalem has grown to the point where now Ein Karim is really on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Nazareth is about 60 miles away from Ein Karim, but Mary would not have traveled a direct route because in between Jerusalem and Nazareth was Samaria. And the Samaritans were heretics and half-breeds, and they were pretty hated by the Jews. They were hated so much that Mary would have traveled around Samaria. So as was common to the time, she would have probably traveled with another family going in that direction, crossed the Jordan, went down the other side, going down the side of the river, the Transjordan, and then crossed over somewhere around Jericho, and then gone through Jerusalem, coming to Jerusalem over the Mount of Olives, and then over to Ein Karim. And here's a picture of Ein Karim right here. Now think about what must have been going through Mary's mind. She's had this vision. She's had no actual evidence that the vision is true. She had to be wondering if she even understood the angel correctly. What she needed was some kind of confirmation, and that's what she got when she got to Elizabeth's house. Because as soon as Elizabeth saw her, she said, "You are the most blessed of women, and your child will be blessed. How could this happen to me that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For you see, when the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby leaped for joy inside me. She who is believed is blessed because of what was spoken to her by the Lord will be fulfilled." That's in Luke 1:42 through 45. Now, Mary stayed about 3 months or so, and then she returned home. Now, what would have been different when Mary got back to Nazareth? She'd be showing, right? Her pregnancy would be obvious. So for her to go home is pretty amazing because it probably meant scandal and shame at the very least. It might even mean being stoned to death for adultery. Except that the angel of the Lord's promises couldn't be kept if she were stoned. So the confirmation of Elizabeth means so much that she was willing to face all the bad consequences that probably waited for her. So when she gets home, we discover that Joseph either didn't know about Gabriel's appearance to Mary or he hadn't believed her. So Joseph had these three choices. He could have had her stoned for adultery, he could have divorced her, and that would have left her as an unwed mother, or he could have just gone ahead and married her. And all of these choices are scandalous in a small town like Nazareth. So there were really no really good options. What Joseph was going to do is divorce her. And it was at this point that he needed confirmation to go ahead with it. And that's when the angel of the Lord appears to Joseph in a dream and tells him not to be afraid to take Mary for his wife, and that the son will be the savior of his people. Now, Matthew also says that this fulfills the prophecy of Isaiah 14, that the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel. Now, one of the common objections that Jews have had to this is that the translation is wrong, that it's kind of a Christian spin on it, and that Isaiah 7:14 doesn't actually say virgin, but the word really means young woman. Now, that word has a semantic range. It's got a spectrum of meanings, and most of the time in Hebrew, it does mean young woman or maiden, but it can also mean virgin. And in this case, it does mean virgin. And we know this because between about 250 to 150 BC, the Sanhedrin had the scribes translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek for the Greek-speaking Jews in Alexandria, Egypt. And this Greek translation, is called the Septuagint. And when they got to Isaiah 7:14, they had a choice of words. They could use a word that specifically meant virgin, or they could choose a word that meant young woman or maiden. And they specifically chose the word that meant virgin. It's their own interpretation that Isaiah 7:14 talks about how the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will name him Emmanuel. That's not a Christian translation. That's a Jewish one. So a few months later, a census was taken, which required Joseph to return to his hometown, which was Bethlehem. Bethlehem was about 5 or 6 miles south of Jerusalem. And these days, Jerusalem has grown so much that it really is on the outskirts. So again, Mary went on this same journey, and they went all the way around the Jordan. And when they got to Jerusalem, they hung a hard left and went south to Bethlehem. And here's a photo that is almost certainly staged, but it's still kind of cool. Probably didn't travel more than about 10 miles a day. And so it took them a week or so to get there. Here's Jerusalem as you approach from the north. I think this is the oldest photo I got, 1860 here on this one. And you can see the village, the old village. Here's an 1877 one. Now, when Joseph and Mary arrived in Bethlehem, where did they go? They went to the inn, right? But what's an inn? To our minds, it's a hotel or a travel lodge or something like that. Turns out there are two different words that get translated as inn in the New Testament, and both of them get used by Luke. One of those words is what Jesus used in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10:34, and that word is pandakion. And that word means inn as we understand it. It's a hotel or a public lodging place. And this is a picture of a pandakion here. You can see it's got a courtyard, and then it's kind of like a motel where you've got these rooms that you enter from the outside there. Most likely, there were no pandakions in Bethlehem. That's because pandakions were found on major trade routes or in big cities, and Bethlehem didn't qualify for either one of those. There was no reason to travel to Bethlehem. You didn't have a lot of visitors there. If you're going to Jerusalem and needed a place to stay, you just keep going because you were so close. And if you were leaving Jerusalem, you wouldn't stop so soon after your journey started. So almost certainly there was no pandakion. Here's the site of the pandakion that was ascribed to the Good Shepherd. Now think about this. If you were returning to your hometown, where would you most likely stay? With relatives, right? And that's probably what happened with Joseph and Mary. They went to his family's home. But if Joseph was taking them to his family's home, then why does the Bible talk about an inn? Well, it turns out that Luke used a different word for the place that they tried to stay. Instead of pandakion, or hotel or inn, he actually says kataluma. Now, to understand what a kataluma is, we have to look at a typical home in that area. Houses at that time usually had 3 rooms. You had this courtyard, and then there was this big family room where everyone slept and ate and cooked. It was 10 feet square or bigger or so. But then you also had a guest room that was always kept empty. This was a culture that valued hospitality highly, and so a place was always kept ready for visitors. And often this room was on the roof of the house, and therefore it was called the upper room. And this is what a kataluma is. This is what gets translated as inn in most Western Bibles, even though some of the newer translations are correcting this to guest room. Eastern translations have always said guest room. And this is where Luke said the Last Supper took place. It took place in a kataluma, which gets translated as upper room. But in the birth story, this is where there is no room. There's no room in the kataluma. Now, Luke knows the difference between a pandakion and a kataluma, and he uses both words in distinct ways. But in the birth story, it's always kataluma. There is no room in the guest room. And that's probably because Joseph had other family members returning home to register for the census, and they were already there. They were already in the kataluma. So the family stayed in the only other room in the house, which is where the animals were kept. Sometimes this was a sunken area in the floor next to the main room. So the main room was on a kind of platform, 3 or 4 feet high, and sometimes there were even feeding troughs or mangers cut into the edge of this platform along the side of the wall. So in this photo here, you see a woman in the little courtyard standing outside the door to the main room of the house, and you see steps going up the outside of the house to a room at the top. That would be the kataluma. And here you can see a neighborhood where you can get a sense that part of the living space of your house included the roof. You'd spend time up there, and that could also include a little area built as a guest room, which is the kataluma. Now, in Bethlehem and throughout Palestine, sometimes the houses were built on top of caves or even within caves. So you'd have maybe the house built near a cave or on top of a cave, and the cave is where the animals were kept. Or sometimes the entire home was built inside of the cave as well. It turns out that the oldest traditions of Jesus' birth says that he was born in a cave. Here's a shot of a cave in the shepherd's field about 1.5 miles from the traditional birthplace of Jesus. I shot this. This is where shepherds would stay, obviously, being in the shepherd's field. But That Jesus was born in a cave and not a wooden stable is really pretty well attested. Justin Martyr, who wrote around 150, said, "When the Christ child was born in Bethlehem, since Joseph could not find lodging in that village, he took up his quarters in a certain cave near the village, and while they were there, Mary brought forth the Christ and placed him in a manger. And here the Magi, who came from Arabia, found him." So Justin Martyr's understanding lacks the idea that Joseph had family here, but he does attest to a cave. Origen does the same thing. He lived between about 184 and 253, and he wrote, "There is shown in Bethlehem the cave where he was born, and the manger in the cave where he was wrapped in swaddling clothes. And this site is greatly talked of in surrounding places, even among the enemies of the faith, it being said that in this cave was born that Jesus who is worshipped and reverenced by the Christians." So the fact that this is believed to be the birthplace of Jesus by people who were not Christians also speaks to his authenticity. In the Eastern traditions, you see that icons will show Jesus born in a cave. And this idea that Jesus was born in a cave was something that was remembered by the end of the first century and the early second century, and that's what Hadrian acted on. Now, the Emperor Hadrian was trying to suppress the Jewish insurrections around 135. They were trying to regain access to the Temple Mount to rebuild the temple, and he expelled them from Jerusalem at that time, and he just tried to eradicate all Jewish culture and places of worship. And the Christians got lumped in with that. So he tried to erase where Jesus was buried by filling in the tomb and the quarry around it and putting a pagan temple on top of it. And then he did the same thing to the birthplace of Jesus. He knew the cave that people venerated as the birthplace of Jesus, and he had it filled in, and he had a grove of trees planted on top of it that he dedicated to Adonis over the spot. And he thought he was destroying the site. But instead of destroying the sites, what he did was mark them. Because in 339, Constantine's mother was on a tour of the Holy Land, and she wanted to visit a lot of the places where the events of the Gospels took place. And she got to Jerusalem, and she was asking where Jesus' tomb was. And they said, well, it's under that pagan statue there where the temple is. And so they had it torn down, and they dug into the ground, and they found a number of tombs, and one of them stood out from the others for certain reasons. And that's what got preserved as Jesus' tomb and is now the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. The same thing happened in Bethlehem. They ripped the trees out, dug into the ground, found the cave, and then that spot was preserved and marked by the Church of the Nativity. Now, when Constantine built the Church of the Nativity, he built an octagonal chapel directly over the cave. In early Byzantine architecture, when a church was built over a place associated with a Christian martyr, it was often octagonal. And that's what Constantine did over the cave. So the original church had this octagonal shape directly over the cave. He did the same thing with the tomb of Jesus. And so the original part of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre had this octagonal shape. Did the same thing over the site of the Holy of Holies that eventually became the Muslim prayer shrine that we call the Dome of the Rock. And you see an octagonal shape over what is probably Peter's house in Capernaum. And you see the plan of this in the top diagram there. But that church only lasted about 200 years before it was destroyed and had to be rebuilt by Justinian. And that's the second plan that you see, and that's the plan that you see today. So when you look at the Church of the Nativity, you can see that under the altar is where the grotto is, and you go in these stairs to the side of the grotto. And here's what it looked like back in the day. Not all those buildings are part of Justinian's church because it's been added to by other religious orders and people who are caretakers of the site. And this is what it looks like today. You can go right up and park right at it. So as you're standing right here, if you turn around and look directly behind you into the marketplace, it looks like that. Now you can see that there is a minaret standing there, and to this day it is predominantly Muslim. And I happen to have been standing there when the afternoon call to prayer went out, and I thought just the incongruence of being at this Christian site while the call of prayer was going out was kind of interesting. So I shot a little video, and it looks like this. Now you can see that there is a big lintel going across the top of that wall there. That used to be the doorway. That was Justinian's doorway. And that got walled up in the early Middle Ages. And you can see there's an arch underneath it. And that became the entrance. But during the Crusader era, that even got walled up because soldiers were riding their horses into the church. And so now it's this tiny little door that you go into. When you go in, it looks like this. Most of this is Justinian. Some of the Constantinian art and architecture is still there, including those mosaics up high. And then the mosaic floor has also been recovered. And so they've opened it up in certain areas, and you can look down and see it. As you move around to the side of the altar to the cave entrance, that's what it looks like when it's not jammed with a ton of people. When it is, it looks like the picture on the left. It's kind of a mosh pit getting down these stairs. And what you see on the right is the exit. So a lot of people wanting to go in, not a lot of people wanting to get out there. And this is what it looks like when you get down there. This photo is shot from the back of the cave. And so everybody is focused on this spot right here. Now, this thing that looks like a fireplace is the traditional spot marked out as the place where Jesus was born. I have no idea how that spot was chosen. It's got to be completely arbitrary. But you can see that right above it, there's an icon of Jesus born in the cave there. Here's a close-up of the spot. That hole inside that 14-pointed star is like a window where you can see the actual cave left in there. Now, the reason why it's all covered in marble and stuff is because the Crusaders tried to beautify it in order to give it the majesty associated with the event that took place there. So it's a completely different kind of philosophy of historic preservation, because by the time they made it majestic, they had completely disguised what actually took place there. So it's a little aggravating. I'd rather see the real thing myself. If you turn around and look behind you, you see the back of the cave, and strangely, there is a door there. You don't go through that door, but there is another section of caves. There's like a network of caves. And in one of the other caves is where Jerome translated the Bible into Common Latin, or the Latin Vulgate. It's where he did his work. Back in the main cave, there's this little alcove, and this is the spot where the manger is traditionally said to have stood, is where this grill is. But it was taken back to Rome. It's in the Vatican archives, they say. And so now we're left with the grill there. It probably wasn't wood. It was probably a stone manger like this. And here's an example where it was built into the wall there. Now, since the census required that everybody return to their hometown, it seems like what probably happened is that Joseph and Mary showed up at a relative's house, and that some other relatives were already in the guest room. And so in Luke 2, 6, and 7, it says that while they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in strips of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. So this appears to say that Mary probably didn't go into labor right when they showed up. It wasn't like, they're coming up on Bethlehem at night, and she goes into labor and Joseph goes into panic mode trying to find a spot in the hotel. That whole scene probably didn't happen. She probably went into labor while they were staying at his relative's house. This idea that Mary went into labor as they approached Bethlehem comes from a second century book called the Proto-Euangelion of James, or the Proto-Evangel of James. Sometimes it's called the Infancy Gospel of James. And this book is one of the oldest writings of the New Testament Apocrypha, and it's a legendary account of Jesus' birth. It kind of tries to supplement all the knowledge that we don't have about it. And one of the things that it adds is that Mary rode a donkey, and it says she went into labor as they were approaching Bethlehem, and that's why they had to find a cave real quick. So that's where this idea came from. Now, if you had been visited by an angel before your baby was born and told that your baby was the savior of the world, wouldn't you wonder just what the baby would look like? I mean, you'd have all this anticipation over 9 months, and for Joseph, at least 6 months, trying to figure out what this was going to be like. It had to be a little bit scary, right? So the time comes and the baby is born, and the baby is totally normal. Looks like a normal baby in every way. So normal that it might make you start to wonder if you had understood everything correctly or not. What they need at that moment is more confirmation. And what happens? That's when the shepherds show up. And they say that the angel of the Lord appeared to them and gave them a sign to look for, and that they would find the prophesied Messiah lying in a manger. So they get the confirmation at exactly the right time. About a month later, Joseph and Mary take the baby up to the temple. And again, their understanding is confirmed by Simeon and Anna. And here's a shot of what the temple probably looked like. Now, at this point, Luke says the family went back to Nazareth. But Matthew says this is when the Magi arrived to visit the baby. Now, the Magi were the scientists and doctors of their day, and because of their knowledge of astrology, they had a certain amount of political power as kingmakers, and they were the ones who recognized the signs in the stars. Matthew says that they came from the east. Now, the east really could mean anywhere beyond the Jordan, and most likely that means Arabia. That's what Justin Martyr thought, and Tertullian and Clement of Rome. They all said Arabia. Gold is mined in Arabia, and frankincense and myrrh come from trees in southern Arabia. We don't know how many wise men there were. There are actually church fathers who think there might have been more than 3. We always think of 3 because there's 3 gifts. We don't even know how many gifts there were, really, but we only have 3 named, and so we associate them with 3 wise men. Now, when it comes to the star that they followed, we often picture the Magi as using it as some kind of like cosmic GPS that takes them straight to a specific address. But there have been many people who tried to tie in an astronomical event, like a conjunction of planets and stars, and they try to explain the Star of Bethlehem as something like that, and that's what the Magi saw. But when we see how Matthew documents it, it looks like it might really be a combination of both. So apparently the Magi knew enough about the Hebrew Bible to follow the star to the capital city of the Jews, Jerusalem. But when they got there, they had to ask where the King of the Jews had been born. So it wasn't taking them straight to the house. It got them pretty close, but it didn't take them all the way there, like we often picture. So they have to stop and ask, and Herod kind of panics. He doesn't know the answer, but he's like freaked out because they're asking about the King of the Jews. So he calls in the chief priests and the scribes, and they're the ones who pinpoint Bethlehem. So when they leave for Bethlehem, Matthew says the star rose once again, and that implies that it hadn't been visible, at least for some time. And this time the star is said to lead them until it stops over the place where Jesus was. And that really is kind of a cosmic GPS. It's not the kind of navigation you could have done by natural means. So the Star of Bethlehem has these elements that are both natural and miraculous to it. If it was purely miraculous, they would have never have needed to stop and ask for directions when they got to Jerusalem. They would have just followed the star. In Matthew 2:11, he says the Magi came to a house or a dwelling where Jesus was. So apparently, they had stayed with the relatives long enough for the guest room to become empty. Or they may have actually moved to Bethlehem permanently to raise Jesus. Remember when Joseph and Mary are in Egypt and they learn that Herod has died. They are warned by the angel of the Lord to return to Israel, but not go back to Bethlehem. Now, there's no reason for the angel of the Lord to tell them not to go back to Bethlehem or back to Judea unless that's what they were planning to do, unless that was the obvious thing to do. And so that might indicate that they had actually moved there, and that's why they end up going back to Nazareth. Another interesting thing about the visit of the Magi is that they probably didn't find a newborn. They found a young child. Luke and Matthew both use two different words to distinguish between the ages of Jesus. In Luke 1:59, when he says the time had come to circumcise John the Baptist, he uses the word paidion, which means child, but can also mean infant. But in Luke 2:12, the angel of the Lord's words to the shepherds say, "And this will be a sign to you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger." And that word baby there is brephos, which means infant or unborn child even. Now, they're not going to find an unborn child, so it's got to mean infant. But when the Magi arrive, they find a paidion. Now, when the Magi were talking with Herod, Herod asked them when the star appeared in the sky. And given that Herod then sent soldiers to kill all the males who were 2 years old and younger, it probably means that the Magi told him they saw the star 2 years ago or something like that, pretty close to that. So probably this paidion means a toddler. It means the Magi showed up and they found Jesus at a house and that he was a toddler. Now, regarding the actual day, there's been a lot of speculation, and that's because the early church didn't really celebrate Christmas. For the most part, they didn't seem very interested in the exact date. Easter was the important date for them to remember. However, the earliest mention of a specific date really is December 25th, and it comes from a commentary on Daniel written by the early church father Hippolytus around 200. And he gave the year as 2 BC, and he even said it was on a Wednesday. And it wasn't until 354 or so that Christmas started being observed, probably first in Rome. And even then, when Christians started celebrating the day, they had different days that they would do it. There were a couple of different days that ended up being proposed as Christmas. And in the Eastern Church, it's still celebrated on January 6th. And that's what the 12 days of Christmas is. And that's what the 12 days of Christmas are, the days between Christmas and Epiphany, which is also when Eastern Orthodoxy celebrates Christmas. Some people think it might have been in the spring or the summer because the sheep were in the field rather than corralled like they are in the winter. But shepherds around Bethlehem have been known to keep the flock out at night in the winter. So we don't really know the exact date. So, as you think about all the ways in which this scene probably isn't what the birth of Jesus looked like, think about all the other reversals that make up the Christmas story. You've got the Magi bringing gifts to a baby who owns the universe and made those gifts. You've got a king born in a peasant's cave, God born to a human being who he himself made. Creator became creature, the invisible became visible, the innocent became guilty, life became death, that death became life, the light of the world was born in obscurity, the central figure of history was born in obscurity, and the transcendent became tangible. There are so many reversals in this Christmas story, and it's interesting because a reversal is another way of saying repentance, and that is what we are called to do in light of the birth of Christ.